So, how many of you have ever been called or called someone a liar? How many of you found out after you did that the other person was telling the truth? That's a little bit of an awkward situation, isn't it? Well, the Bible actually tells us of a situation where this happened. Let's take a quick look. This just sets some framework for what we're going to be getting into today. Jeremiah 43. Now, does anybody know what happened just before Jeremiah 43? What happened in Jeremiah 42, chapter 42? Jeremiah had gone to God on behalf of the leaders of those who hadn't been taken into exile, those who had returned from where they had been scattered. There had been a coup just a couple chapters before this where the Babylonian appointed leader had been killed along with a whole bunch of men. And so there's fear in the air. And these leaders come to Jeremiah and go, pray to your God. And what's interesting is Jeremiah goes, I will pray to your God. He is your God just like he's my God. But then he gives them this message that God is commanding them to stay put. Don't leave, because if you go to Egypt where you want to go, the death and destruction you are afraid of will follow you. And here is what these leaders say to Jeremiah when he gives this message from God. Jeremiah 43, verse 1. When Jeremiah had finished telling the people all the words of the Lord their God, everything the Lord had sent him to tell them, Azariah, son of Hoshea, and Johanan, son of Kareah, and all the arrogant, it outright calls these men arrogant men, said to Jeremiah, you are lying. The Lord our God has not sent you to say, you must not go to Egypt to settle there. But Baruch, son of Neriah, is inciting you against us to hand us over to the Babylonians so that they may kill us or carry us into exile. Now, I understand that these men were quite fearful. They were terrified that the strong arm of the Babylonian Empire was going to come down. You did something bad. We're killing all of you. You disobeyed. You killed the guy we appointed. And so they want to leave the area. They want to escape. But God is telling them, no, I am with you. There will be peace if you stay. But it doesn't fit their image. It doesn't match what they think should be happening. Do we ever do the same thing as Christians today? I know that's a tough question for us. We don't like to think of ourselves as having as many parallels in our struggles with our relationship and our connection with God as the Israelites did. But yet, we do. And that, friends, is why I think it's important for us to study these heroes of faith. And the element that we're going to look at today specifically is trusting, even when it doesn't make sense. Trusting and standing on the promises of God. You see, every day when we walk over to that light switch, we trust that when we flip that switch, as long as we paid the bills, the lights are going to come on. We trust that when we turn the hot water on, it might take a second, but we're going to get hot water. We trust that when we walk out to our car and we put the key in the ignition or push the button, that it's going to start. We even trust that the stove or the microwave or the oven is going to heat our food up. And how many of you are ever frustrated when the microwave doesn't seem to heat your food up? That microwave, in some way, shape, or form, has broken your trust. But here is the problem that I see many of us as Christians facing? When God calls us to trust in Him and to stand on His promises, we often respond in anger because it doesn't make sense. Why would God make me do that? Why would God ask me to do that? He's not even making you do it. Why would He ask me to do that? It doesn't make sense. Another response that we give is we shut down. We ignore the message that God has for us because it doesn't fit what we think that message is. And one of the most dangerous ways that we do this is in our judgment of where others are in their lives, where they are in their walk with God specifically as Christians. And despite all of these examples of different responses, these are biblical responses that we see play out in story after story. But despite all of these examples, all of these different types of responses, I want us to focus on somebody who actually trusted in God, who stood on the promises of God. Let's go to Genesis chapter 12. We're going to talk about Abraham because Abraham trusted God. When God asked him to do something, he went, all right, God, I'm standing on your promises and I'll do it, even if it doesn't make sense. Now, I want to make an important note here. When we find Abraham, for the first couple elements that we're going to look at, he's still called Abram. And only after God changes his name does he become Abraham. I will do my best to make sure that I refer to him as Abram and Abraham respectively. I can't make any promises on whether I'll get tongue-tied or not. Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. And I'll actually be reading from the NIV. That's what I have here with me. Y'all are welcome to follow along in whatever version you would like. Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse those who curse you. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." That's an incredible promise, isn't it? But there's a catch here. You see, just before this, we find that Abram's wife, Sarai, was childless. She was barren. She wasn't able to have children. So how is Abraham or Abram going to be this worldwide thing, his descendants so numerous? He doesn't even have an heir to all of his property. But nonetheless, verse 4, so Abram went as the Lord had told him. He stood on the promises of God. He stepped out in faith because he trusted God. And Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran. And they set out for the land of Canaan. And they arrived there. Now, what's interesting is, there in verse 1, go to the land I will show you. God didn't go, Abraham, I want you to go to the land of Canaan. Well, I'll show you the land to go to, but will you go? Will you stand on my promise? And he went. Abram traveled through the land, verse 6, as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. Abraham had a face-to-face. He literally, the Lord appeared to him. Not just spoke to him, but appeared to him. And so he worships God. And this is actually the first time that we see Abram, at the time, Abram, soon to be known as Abraham, and God is speaking to him. God is there face to face, talking to Abram. And God gives Abram a promise. But he also gives Abram a choice on whether he will trust that promise, whether he will stand on the promises of God. And he chooses to pack everything up without having descendants, without knowing where he was going, and to follow wherever God led him, to a land he didn't know. He didn't know where God was going to lead him, but he went, God, I'm in because I'm standing on your promises. Then there's a second time that Abram stands on the promises of God. And this develops over several chapters, actually. We're going to just kind of glance over this. We have Abram and Lot when they separate in Genesis 13. And Lot takes the best of the land. And what's amazing, verse 14, Genesis 13, verse 14, the Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted from him, look around from where you are, to the north and south, to the east and west. All the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. He still has no kids at this point, by the way. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. And he still has no kids, and God has made this promise. He doesn't even have a single child, much less a male child, which was required to pass inheritance along. And he's promised this. Now, these first two promises, and really a lot of the promises we see in the story of Abram, or Abraham, depending on which part of it you're reading, are intertwined. When God promises land, he also promises descendants. And when he promises descendants, he also promises land. And could you imagine being in the situation that Abram is in? You don't have descendants. You have nobody to pass anything along to, and God is going, your descendants are going to be as numerous as the sand on the seashore. More numerous than the dust on the earth. There's a lot of dust. I was just cleaning my house yesterday, and you would not believe the amount of dust that can show up in a house in a week. And that's just a small, and I mean a little tiny fraction of all the dust in this earth. Imagine having no children and God going, you're going to have more descendants than the dust particles in the world. Even the dust particles in your house. That's a whole lot. And now multiply it by the size of this world. That is incredible. And what's really important for us to note is that after each of these high points with God, we see a catastrophic mistake made by Abram. You see, right before him and Lot separate in this second reassuring of the promise God has given, Abraham struggles to stand on the promises of God. He goes into Egypt because of a famine. And while he is there, he is afraid that he is going to be killed by the Pharaoh because his wife, as the Bible tells us, was beautiful. And so he lies to the Pharaoh and his officials and says, "She's not my wife, she's my sister." Pharaoh finds out from God, not from Abram, who Sarai actually is. And he kicks them out. Wow. And then God gives this promise. God goes, "I'm going to send you a kid. I'm going to let you have all this land." He's face to face again. And then something outside of Abram's control. An enemy attacks and carries off all his family. All of what he's owned. All of what those around him own. And he stands on God's promise and he goes after them, pursues them, and overpowers them. And returns. And in the middle of all of this, or just after all of this, God comes to Abram and he creates a covenant with him. And here is the thing. This covenant was cut in blood. And when I say cut, the Hebrew word used when a covenant is made is literally translated as to cut, as in you're cutting fruit. And God gives Abram these instructions. And he tells him what to do, and they split these animals in half. And I won't go into the gory detail. I'd like to keep this family friendly. But here is what happens. You see, God comes and passes between the halves of these animals. But he doesn't allow Abram to do so. I believe that there is more than meets the eye here. It's not just that Abram wasn't willing to. It was God going, "Look, Abram, I'm making this promise with you. But it's not about what you can do or what you have done. It's about what I can do through you." And so here we find this covenant cut in blood. And then it seems like Abram starts to fail to stand on these promises. Because chapter 16, we see where Sarai goes, "Hey, I can't give you a kid, but my Egyptian servant girl can." And so she gives Abram, her servant, to bear them a child. Now, in our modern day legal terminology, Abram raped this servant girl. She did not have a choice. She was a slave. And then since that wasn't enough, tensions built up in the house of Abram. So bad that Hagar runs into the desert, already shattered from what she's been through, and is ready to die. She's lost all hope. And yet, God hasn't left her. I have no doubt that with her having been an Egyptian, that she didn't know who the Lord was, who Adonai was, who Yahweh was. And God reveals himself to her in a powerful way. And what I want to highlight here is that even though Abram's faith was wavering, even though he was failing to stand on the promises of God, it still led someone to him. even if it was in unfortunate circumstances. And we see this promise made from God. I'll let you read it on your own time because I'm going to run out of time otherwise. And the angel of the Lord gave her this promise. The angel of the Lord, not just an angel, but the angel of the Lord. And in response, verse 13, Genesis 16, verse 13, she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That's translated as Adonai El Roi, the God of seeing, or the God who sees me. Someone who we don't know what kind of spiritual background she had other than that of the Egyptian culture. Testifies about God through the mistakes of a man of God. But the story doesn't end there. You see, when Abram was 99, Genesis 17, he's given the covenant of circumcision. And this is when God changes his name. You see, Abram meant exalted father, but Abraham meant father of many. Both are really cool names, but Abraham pointed towards the promise that God had given. The name did. And Abraham chose to stand on that promise. And even though he's had this powerful experience, has entered this covenant with God. We see in Genesis chapter 20 a mistake almost identical to what happened in Egypt. I'll let you read that for yourselves. It's eerily similar. And I would encourage you to go home and study this particular, not just this part, but this particular man of faith for yourself. And one of the best resources that you can use alongside of this, I would say, is Patriarchs and Prophets. Because it walks through, in more depth than I can go into here, the life of Abraham. And the story of Abraham reaches its pinnacle in Genesis chapter 21. When Isaac, the promised son, is born. Isaac's name literally means laughter. Why? Well, verse 6, Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. God has brought joy into my life, and others are going to experience it. But then, God tests Abraham. Genesis 22. It literally says, sometime later, God tested Abraham. Now, how did he test Abraham? He told him to go to this mountain that he would show him and sacrifice his one and only son, the one that he loved, as a burnt offering. Now, that son who you love, your one son who you love, echoes John 3:16. I think there's a lot of symbolism here. And Abraham goes up. He doesn't hesitate. The next morning, he gets up and starts out. And he goes and he takes Isaac with him. And he doesn't tell anybody what's happening. He just says that they're going to offer a sacrifice. And they go. In verse 7, they're climbing up the mountain. Actually, let's start in verse 6. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife, as the two of them went on together. Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said. "But where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. This man who had been promised this son, and it had been promised that it was through Isaac that he would become the father of many nations, is standing there, knife out, ready to sacrifice his son. And the most powerful word I have found in the Bible comes next, or sequence of words, rather. But the angel of the Lord, but God, called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." And then, as we read further, the Lord provides a ram for the sacrifice. Now, there is no question asked as to whether this was a scary experience for Abraham. But he chose to stand on the promises of God. I don't know if I could, but Abraham did. And I think there's an important lesson for us to learn from this. We see over and over and over again where Abraham has made mistakes as God has been calling him and promising him all of these different things. But God didn't leave him there. God showed Abraham grace. God forgave Abraham when he made mistakes, when he messed up, when he hurt people around him. And because of that grace, Abraham was able to know that God was still there with him. Now, as we've talked about, Abraham's life was far from perfect. In fact, for some of us, we might even be tempted to compare our lives to him and go, well, I haven't done that. I'm better than he was. But we do the same thing with those of us that are here in church. We compare ourselves to others around us. We compare where we are in our spiritual journey to where somebody else is, and we condemn them when they're not at the same point in their trust with God. Where in the Bible is our power and authority to condemn people because of where they are in their relationship to God when they're not where we are? Where is it? Because I haven't found it yet. But here is the most powerful part of this: the promise of grace. Friends, if you have a challenge in your life, if you have wrestled with comparing yourself to others, if you've wrestled with doubting God, not trusting God, you are not hopeless. Because God has promised to be there with you. He's promised to be there with you to the end of the age. Promise that he will never change. And part of that never changing is his grace. Friends, I urge you, we are not going to ever be able to be perfect on our own. The only way we ever achieve any form of perfection at all is through the blood of Christ. I don't care if you live for a century and a half, however long you live. You will never be able to be perfect enough without the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross to be accepted by God. Isaiah tells us that our righteousness of ourselves is like filthy rags. And when this happens, the high priest wearing these filthy rags is before God. And rather than God striking him down, God shows this high priest grace. He offers him forgiveness, the repentance of his sins, and he re-clothes him with clean white garments. Now, how does he do that? He does it through the blood of Christ and the grace that he can offer through that sacrifice. Friends, rather than focusing on perfection and burning bridges with those around us, let's focus on standing on the promises of mercy and grace and forgiveness, because they are more powerful, more important than being perfect. They are what will get you into a walk with God, what will save you, what offers hope. Because God is looking out for you. He is offering his grace, and he has promised to forgive you. He's promised his salvation to those who trust in him. And he is in the business of saving people. He's in the business of healing broken people through the blood of Christ. And friends, this is why, even though Abraham had made mistakes, he is still considered a hero of faith. Because he was standing on the promises of God. He was standing on God's grace and standing in God's grace. That you help us to stand on your promises. God, give us courage, give us strength to step out, trusting in you, trusting in the promises that you have given. And God, I ask that you help those of us who wrestle with your grace to find it. And God, if that means breaking us and bringing us to our knees, do it. Because God, you are the only way. Jesus is the only way to you. And God, we are so thankful for the promises that you have given. May we stand on those promises today. In your name I pray.